So before we get into the SOSA, let me briefly describe who Trellis Company is. We were formerly a loan guarantor called TG for Texas Guaranteed. We no longer guarantee loans, but we still have a public mission to help borrowers successfully repay their loans and to promote access and success in higher education. Over the last nearly 4 decades, we have established a strong record of research and philanthropy with a particular focus on underserved populations. So now let's get into the SOSA report. It covers a variety of topics related to higher education. It starts with demographics, looking at things like race and ethnicity projections and poverty rates. And then it moves through some pre-college topics and then into college, describing college students and how they pay for school. After a section about college attainment, we look at student financial wellness and programs aimed at improving retention. And following that is a section on loan repayment outcomes, and then a section taking a broader look at statewide higher education and student debt policies. The SOSA focuses on Texas, but there are sometimes comparisons to the US or to other states, and some pages are just national only. It depends on the data sources being used to answer the questions. As I mentioned before, the SOSA is intended to be a reference document designed to give you a quick stat on the topic of interest, so you don't really need to read all 12 sections in a sequential order to get what you need. The pages are designed to stand on their own. Each page gives you a headline, a graphic, a brief summary text, and the data sources. You can scan the table of contents to find the pages or sections of interest and go from there. So for the rest of this webinar, I'd like to demonstrate how you might put some of the pages together to develop a narrative or describe an issue. So let's turn to the first demonstration, looking at Texas demographics and the importance of the education of the Hispanic population to the future of Texas. The value of education has long been understood. Every state in the nation has had compulsory schooling laws in place for at least 100 years. Completing high school has been an important step towards a brighter future for decades. However, as of 2016, 37% of Hispanics in Texas aged 25 and older did not have a high school diploma, compared to 12% of African Americans and just 7% of whites. Looking at high school graduates, we observe a gap in immediate college enrollment between different race ethnicity groups. The percentage of white high school graduates who enroll in college the following fall still far exceeds the percentage of non-white. However, this gap is closing. The percentage of Hispanic students, which shrank to 8 percentage points by 2016, due both to rising college enrollment rates among Hispanic students and falling rates among white students. A similar trend is seen comparing African American students to white students. Enrolling in college immediately following high school graduation is important because delaying post-secondary enrollment after high school graduation is a risk factor for eventually dropping out of college or never enrolling at all. And earning a college degree is becoming more and more important to the ability to obtain a good job with a good salary. By 2020, approximately 54% of jobs in Texas and 65% of jobs nationally will require some kind of formal training or education beyond high school. For employees without any post-secondary education, most job openings by 2020 will come from the food service, personal service, and blue-collar occupations such as construction, production, and transportation. Openings that generally require post-secondary education will be concentrated in sales and office support, healthcare, education, and managerial roles. Stepping outside of the academic track a bit, let's take a look at the bigger picture of poverty rates. Texas had the 14th highest poverty rate in the nation, with 15.6% of Texans living in poverty in 2016. In that year, poverty was defined as having an annual income of $24,339 or less for a family of 4 with 2 children, or $12,486 for an individual under 65 years old. Poverty rates in Texas vary widely by region. By a large margin, the Rio Grande region has the highest rates of overall and childhood poverty at 30% and 42% respectively, at least 11 percentage points higher than any other region in Texas. Not surprisingly, those with fewer resources are less likely to be able to afford college. This is true across all racial and ethnic categories, as you can see in the top chart. However, only 18% of white high school graduates in Texas are considered to be economically disadvantaged, while 63% of Hispanic and 58% of African American high school graduates are. Poverty is an issue that can affect anyone, but we see that it disproportionately affects students of color in Texas. In the year 2050, 61% of children, 60% of 18 to 24-year-olds, and 56% of 25 to 44-year-olds are projected to be Hispanic. Increasingly, the future of Texas, including its economic prosperity, as well as the expertise needed to run business, government, and infrastructure, will depend on the education of its non-white populations, which, as we've seen, have historically had lower incomes, higher rates of poverty, and lower likelihood of attending and completing college compared to whites. Focusing on the educational success of Hispanic students in particular is important for the future of Texas. Now let's take a look at another narrative. This one's more of just looking at the characteristics of what it looks like to pay for university education in Texas. The cost of attendance for college students is more than just tuition and fees. It also includes books and supplies, food and housing, and other expenses, and this can include things like transportation, clothes, insurance, etc. At the average public four-year university in Texas, tuition and fees are just 37% of a full-time undergraduate's total cost of attendance. Books and supplies make up just 5% of the total, and the remaining 58% is the cost of living, food, housing, and other expenses. These costs are not discretionary. Students must eat, and unless they live rent-free, they must pay housing expenses as well. The average cost of attendance for 2 semesters at a Texas university was $22,993 in the 2016-17 school year. The cost of attendance is the starting point for determining financial aid. The student's expected family contribution is an amount that a federal formula determines a family is able to contribute based on their income and family size and the number of children in college. This expected contribution is subtracted from the cost of attendance to calculate the student's financial need. A financial aid package made up of things like grants and loans can be put together to cover part or all of that need. Institutions set their own cost of living amounts based on where they are located. Federal law requires each institution to determine an appropriate and reasonable amount using its own methods. Typically, institutions recalculate their cost of attendance annually. Schools use various methods to determine their cost of attendance, including things like student surveys, interviews, and economic data. Industry organizations can also provide some guidance, but each institution has flexibility and the responsibility to reach its own estimate by its own means. Most students don't end up paying the full cost of attendance due to things like tuition discounting and free money like grants and scholarships. The net price is the cost of attendance minus all grants and scholarships, leaving the amount that students must either pay out of pocket or with loans. As you would expect, the net price increases along with family income, as those with more resources are expected to be able to pay more of their educational costs. And this also reflects that needier students tend to receive more need-based grant aid. In the public four-year sector, students with the lowest incomes had a net price for 2 semesters of about $8,300, climbing to about $20,500 for those in the highest income quintile. The cost of living amounts are important because they are part of the equation that determines how much financial aid students are eligible to receive. If these estimates are set too low, students may not receive enough aid to reasonably afford food and housing while enrolled. Despite their best efforts, institutions may not accurately estimate these costs every time. The chart in this slide shows the results from a 2013 study that compared institutionally set costs against federal estimates of average rent, utilities, and food by county. About a third of all institutions nationwide had lower living cost estimates compared to the federal estimates. Additionally, some students have dependents of their own to care for while enrolled. These students face particularly high living costs as they ideally need more space than just one person, and having children may make it more difficult to have roommates. In 2016, a student with one child living in a 2-bedroom apartment would have cost almost twice as much for food and housing compared to a student sharing a 2-bedroom apartment with a roommate. %88 of student aid came from the federal government in the public 4-year sector in Texas, and nearly 70% of student financial aid at public 4-year institutions in Texas was in the form of loans. Students at universities in Texas are highly dependent on loans and also on the federal government. The buying power of the federal Pell Grant, the largest grant program in the US and in Texas, has declined over the last 3 decades. Designed to be the foundation of need-based grant aid, only undergraduates with significant financial need receive the Pell Grant. In the 2015-16 academic year, the average Pell Grant in Texas covered only 16% of the average cost of attendance for 2 semesters at a Texas public university. While the average Pell Grant tends to increase from one year to the next, these increases have failed to keep pace with increases in the cost of college. Now, many students will work while they're in school to pay for school and or their living costs. From 1966 to 1981, an undergraduate could have paid for the total cost of attendance for 2 semesters at a public university by working about 24 hours per week, every week of the year at minimum wage. It was certainly possible to work one's way through school on a low-wage job in those years. However, in the 1980s, education costs began to climb, and minimum wage increases occurred less frequently. By 1989, the number of work hours needed to cover costs stood at 39 hours per week. As costs have continued to increase and minimum wage has been pretty stagnant, the number of work hours needed have increased sharply since the year 2000. Historically, cost of attendance tends to be a little lower in Texas compared to national averages, but even in Texas in 2016, 64 hours of work at minimum wage would be needed to cover the average cost of attendance at a Texas public university for 2 semesters, and that's every week of the year. Given the university costs and the available resources, many students have unmet need. That is the difference between their total cost of attendance and all financial aid, which includes grants, loans, family contribution. In 2015, students attending public 4-year institutions in Texas with family incomes under $75,000 had more than $8,000 in unmet need on average for that school year. University costs continue to rise every year, outpacing available aid in many cases, leaving many students with thousands of dollars in unmet need. And then for our last section here, we'll take a look at Texas community college students. The community college sector is a hugely important and vital sector across the US and particularly in Texas. Nearly half of undergraduates in Texas attend public 2-year institutions in the fall of 2016, a far higher percentage than in the US. In fact, more than 3/4 of all Texas freshmen in fall of 2015 were enrolled at public 2-year schools, which is depicted in that bottom chart. The student populations enrolled at public 2-year schools can look pretty different compared to their peers at 4-year institutions or at for-profit schools. There are far more full-time students in the 2-year sector than in any other sector in that top chart. And these students tend to be older compared to the 4-year sectors, as you can see in the bottom chart. Over 1/3 of public 2-year students were first generation, again more compared to the 4-year sectors. Many college students also struggle with housing issues. The national survey being summarized in this chart defines homelessness as being without a place to live, often residing in a shelter, an automobile, an abandoned building, or outside. Housing insecurity is less severe and includes things like the inability to pay full housing costs and moving in with others due to financial issues. While not statistically representative of all college students, in this survey, a large percentage of students indicated that they had housing issues in the previous year. Texas community college costs have historically been lower than the national average, though Texas has been catching up in recent years. The chart here shows the total cost of attendance, which, as we learned in the earlier section, includes tuition and fees, books and supplies, and living costs. In the Texas community college sector, tuition and fees make up about 21% of the total cost of living. Oh, I'm sorry, of the total cost of attendance. Books and supplies make up about 9%, and living costs make up the remaining 70%. The vast majority of the expense of attending a community college is made up of largely non-discretionary costs. As before, people must eat and they must have a place to live. And again, most students don't end up paying the full cost of attendance due to things like tuition discounting and free money like grants and scholarships. So that net price is the cost of attendance minus all grants and scholarships, leaving the amount that students must pay either out of pocket or with loans. And again, we see that the net price increases along with family income. In the public two-year sector, students with the lowest incomes had a net price for 2 semesters of just over $6,000, climbing to about $12,300 for those in the highest income quintile. Even for students in this highest quintile, the community college sector is more affordable than any other sector for students with any income, with just a few exceptions. Now, the data used for this chart comes from the Department of Education, and it has its limitations. It only includes first-time, full-time undergraduates, which can make up pretty small percentages of the student population at many community colleges. So, as always, knowing the data sources is important for how to interpret what you're seeing. And as I mentioned at the top, each page in the SOSA has the sources at the bottom of the page. The average unmet need decreases as income increases. And that might sound logical on one hand, but on the other hand, it means that any need-based aid that low-income students are receiving doesn't seem to be making much of a dent. And the data source for this is the Texas Higher Education Coordinating Board. And then, as mentioned in that last section about university costs, students with dependents will likely have higher costs, cost of living. And in the community college sector, we tend to see higher percentages of students with dependents compared to the four-year sectors. Now, looking at the source and type of aid by sector, nearly all financial aid in the public two-year sector comes from the federal government, as you can see in the top chart. And almost 60% of that aid is in the form of grants, which is likely mostly Pell grants, as you can see in the bottom chart. And even though many fewer students at community colleges borrow compared to the four-year sectors, still 40% of all direct student aid in the 2015-16 year was in the form of loans at public two-year schools in Texas. Obtaining at least some college education confers financial benefits upon the individual. While there is a large boost at the bachelor's degree and beyond level in terms of earnings and unemployment rates, there are definite benefits to obtaining some college education or an associate's degree. Now, next for the SOSA, we are already starting work on the 2019 publication because we would like to get it out before the 86th Texas legislative session begins in January. And we continuously evaluate the topics and sources. We think about higher education topics all the time over here at Trellis. And so anytime we come across new or updated sources or new issues kind of pop up as the hot things that people are talking about, we think about whether or not it would make sense to include it in the SOSA and kind of add it to the list for the next time. So we're always thinking through these things, and so hopefully SOSA is always a good, relevant reference document for people. And I am the lead on the SOSA publication, and here's my contact information. And below that is information for my boss, who is the Director of Research here at Trellis, Jeff Webster. You can reach us via phone or email, and also please follow us on Twitter at Trellis Research. And thank you very much for your time today. And if there are any questions or comments, I can take a look at those. Okay, PowerPoint. Yes, we can send out a PowerPoint to all of the participants in the webinar today. And at the bottom of each page, on the PowerPoint, anytime I had a chart, I put the section and page number in the SOSA where that can be found as well. Well, if you have any questions or comments about the SOSA or anything else related to Trellis or higher education policy or anything else, you can contact me or Jeff Webster, and we would love to have conversation. And thank you so much for your participation today. Oh, got one real quick about FAFSA completion by school regions. We do have a page about FAFSA completion split out by Texas regions. I have information about FAFSA completion by school regions, but it's not something we put in the SOSA because it kind of is a long list and kind of dense, but I'm happy to share things if you want to contact me separate from this. All right, thank you very much.